In CCTV footage from Japan, a specter glides behind a man before following him into a taxi. Secret garden party guests can get their illegal drugs tested this weekend. Initially, nothing seems out of the ordinary as the man in a white shirt waits for a cab in a quiet Japanese town. But as he makes his way towards the waiting car, a dark figure moves behind him for a few seconds. When the man closes the car door, the shape disappears, possibly having floated into the car or simply vanished into thin air. The ghostly figure appears to be a woman wearing a robe and hood and possibly carrying a bag. Previously, it has been Japanese taxi drivers themselves reporting ghost customers. Cabbies in Ishinomaki, one of the worst hit areas by the 2011 earthquake, claimed they have picked up people who vanished during the journey. As an Uber driver, I often find myself cruising down deserted country roads, especially during the winter when the snow blankets everything in sight. This one time, I've picked up a girl from a nearby gas station, and the drop location looked like it's middle of nowhere, and she wasn't talking much. It's my last ride for the day. When I saw her from the mirror, she was serious, and her hair was over her eyes with a creepy look like one from Ring Trilogy horror movies. Despite it's an isolated location, I've dropped her near this old house. It was one of those chilly nights when I was heading back home after a long day of driving. The road was dark, illuminated only by my headlights, and there were no streetlights to be seen. Snow piled up on the sides, reaching about 3 feet high, making the landscape look like a scene from a winter wonderland. I remember the moment vividly. I was alone in my car, singing along to one of my favorite songs. The music was loud, and I was lost in the rhythm, having a good time. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a strange noise coming from the speakers. It sounded like someone talking, but I couldn't make out the words. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. I turned down the music, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the voice persisted, faint yet unmistakable. It was a girl's voice, whispering in the background. I tried to convince myself that it was just a glitch in the speaker system, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I turned off the music completely, hoping to silence the strange whispers. In the silence that followed, I could still hear the faint sound of the girl's voice. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that settled over me. I mustered up the courage to speak, asking the unseen presence not to harm me and demanding to know what it was. There was a moment of silence, followed by a strange noise, almost like someone trying to speak but failing to form words clearly. Fear gripped me like never before, and I knew I had to get out of there. I switched off the speaker once again, my heart pounding in my chest. I was shaking uncontrollably, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I glanced at my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Panic began to set in as I realized I was completely alone, stranded on a deserted road with no way to call for help. In a state of sheer terror, I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car, desperate to escape whatever unseen presence lurked inside. But as soon as my feet touched the ground, I heard it, the terrifying cry of the unknown girl emanating from the speakers. My blood ran cold, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I couldn't explain it. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the sound was unmistakably human, a girl's cry of distress. I knew I had to get away from there as fast as I could. But as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something strange. The frost on the windshield seemed to be spreading, creeping inward like tendrils of ice. I panicked, my heart racing as I realized something was terribly wrong. I screamed and pounded on the windshield, hoping to break free from whatever sinister force held me captive. Miraculously, the frost cleared, but when I tried to start the car, it wouldn't budge. It was as if some unseen entity was toying with me, trapping me in its icy grip. With no other option, I retreated back into the car, the cold seeping into my bones. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to permeate the air. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from the darkness outside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the sound grew louder, accompanied by a rasping noise. I knew I had to do something, anything to escape this nightmare. So with trembling hands, I began to scream and pound on the windows, hoping to scare off whatever unseen entity lurked outside. But my efforts were vain. The windows frosted over rapidly, obscuring my vision and trapping me in a prison of ice. I screamed and pounded harder, the fear consuming me from within. It felt like an eternity passed, with each moment bringing me closer to the brink of madness. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. Exhausted and defeated, I collapsed into the back seat, tears streaming down my face. I knew I was running out of time, that whatever was out there would soon claim me as its next victim. With a heavy heart, I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help. Since there's no signal, I ran into nearby fields for over a mile. To my relief, I found that I finally had a signal. With shaking hands, I dialed my friend's number and sent him my location, praying that he would come to my rescue. As I waited for him to arrive, I huddled in the darkness, the cold creeping in around me like a sinister specter. Then I heard ghostly cry again, so I ran towards my car and quickly hid in my car back seat. Agonizing 50 minutes felt like an eternity. When my friend finally pulled up beside me, I felt a rush of relief wash over me. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and let him in, grateful for his presence. It was only then that I realized the extent of the damage. The windows of my car were cracked and frosted over, a testament to the terror I had endured. In the days that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that in the air, the sense that something dark and malevolent lurked just beyond the edge of my consciousness. As I write these words, the memory of that fateful night still haunts me. And though I may never find closure, I take solace in the fact that I survived, that I lived to tell this tale. I've been driving Uber since 6 years. It happened to me one night as I was driving home after a long day of work. I was tired, just wanting to get home and rest. My mind was elsewhere, not fully focused on the road ahead. As I turned onto the street leading to my house, I noticed a girl standing by the side of the road. She looked like she was waiting for someone, her fancy red dress catching my eye. Despite my exhaustion, I couldn't ignore her. It didn't feel right to leave her alone out there in the dark. So I pulled up beside her and offered her a ride. She nodded silently and climbed into the passenger seat of my taxi. I asked her where she needed to go, and she gave me directions. As we drove along, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. We were passing through a wooded area, with trees looming over the road. Suddenly, without warning, the girl's door swung open, and she was thrown out of the car, disappearing into the darkness of the forest below. I slammed on the brakes and rushed out, but there was no sign of her. I searched for what felt like hours, calling out her name, but it was futile. Eventually, I had to accept that she was gone. Confused and shaken, I drove home, unable to shake off the strange events of the night. The next morning, I couldn't get off the feeling of unease. I needed answers. So I decided to follow the directions the girl had given me the night before. I arrived at a house and knocked on the door, asking if anyone knew the girl I had given a ride to. To my horror, I was told that she had died years ago. According to the people in the house, she had been at a party with her friend when tragedy struck. Her friend, who was drunk, was driving too fast. As they were nearing her home, the door suddenly flew open and she was thrown out of the car. She rolled off the road and into the forest, where she hit her head on a tree trunk and died. I'm a cab driver, and this is the story of one chilling night I'll never forget. It was during my usual night shift, and as the clock in my dashboard slowly ticked towards midnight, I cruised through the quiet city roads, looking for fares. Then I saw her, a beautiful young woman standing at the corner of a traffic light junction. Her long black hair flowed down her back, and she was dressed in a flowing white dress. She seemed out of place in the stillness of the night. Without hesitation, I pulled over and offered her a ride. She didn't speak a word, but simply got into the cab. As soon as she entered, a strong scent of jasmine filled the car, overwhelming my senses. I asked her where she wanted to go, but instead of answering, she handed me a piece of paper with an address written on it. I wasn't familiar with the location, so I asked for her help in directing me. She nodded silently, and I started driving, relying on her nods to guide me. There is odd silence between us. We eventually reached the road indicated on the paper. It was a narrow, dark road, far from the city center. The mist had descended, further obscuring our surroundings. As I cautiously drove forward, I realized with growing dread that there were no houses in sight, only rows upon rows of gravestones. Fear gripped me, and I couldn't bring myself to look into the rearview mirror. I nervously asked the girl if this was truly where she wanted to go, but she remained silent. With trembling hands, I continued driving, desperately hoping to find a house where she belonged. Suddenly, I felt a light tap on my shoulder. I stopped the car, and she handed me the fare without a word. I took it without counting and felt her leave the cab. Without looking back, I sped away, eager to leave that eerie place behind. The next morning, curiosity compelled me to return to the spot where I had dropped the girl. To my horror, I realized it was a vast cemetery, the road slicing through it. I found the lot number she had given me, and there, on a fresh gravestone, was her picture staring back at me. Chilled to the bone, I hurried back to my cab. Remembering the money she had given me, I checked the ashtray, only to find Chinese hell notes. Panic seized me and I threw them out of the cab, speeding away in terror. Later, I learned the truth, that a girl had died in a hit-and-run accident at the very junction where I had picked her up. It had happened around midnight, and the driver responsible was never caught. That night will haunt me forever. It was Chinese New Year's Eve, around 7:30 p.m., and I, Chris, a 60-year-old cab driver from Louisiana, was hurrying back home to join my family for our traditional dinner celebration. As I drove along a remote path far from my home, memories of the deserted farm village that once occupied the area flooded my mind. Despite my rush to get home, I couldn't help but notice the 4 bus stops along the roadside. My attention was drawn to a young lady at one of the bus stops, signaling for a ride. Initially, I considered stopping for her, but my punctuality-conscious nature urged me to keep moving. However, as I continued driving, another woman caught my eye. She wore a red t-shirt and black skirt, a sight that felt strangely familiar, though I couldn't see her face clearly in the fading light. By the time I reached the 3rd bus stop, a sense of unease crept over me. Once again, there was a lady dressed in red and black, signaling for a ride. How could she have moved so quickly between stops? The distance between them was nearly a mile. Feeling increasingly unnerved, I pressed harder on the accelerator. As I approached the 4th bus stop, a figure charged towards my car with alarming speed. Despite my driving at over 50 miles per hour, the woman flew over my vehicle and landed in a drain beside the bus stop. I cried out in horror, realizing that she too wore red and black attire. Shaken to my core, I reported the incident to the police. To my disbelief, the body they found was that of a young Chinese woman, aged between 20 and 25, who had been dead for several days, her body already showing signs of decay. The cause of death? Stab wounds, not injuries from a car accident, as I had feared. After giving my statement to the police, I hoped the ordeal was over. However, fate had other plans. A week later, I won first prize in the lottery with my taxi's number plate, a stroke of luck that brought me a significant sum of money. Overjoyed by my win, I celebrated, only to suffer a fall in the bathroom that left me with a fractured arm and a hospital admission. In the hospital, plagued by nightmares, I heard a young woman's voice in my dreams, calling me uncle and asking when I would join her. The inflammation in my wound worsened, adding to my suffering. It was then that a friend, a priest, suggested I give up my lottery winnings as a form of repentance. He believed the young woman's spirit harbored deep grievances and had become a vengeful ghost. After much internal struggle, I decided to donate my winnings to the charity community chest. Miraculously, my health improved rapidly thereafter, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. However, the peace was short-lived. Soon after my discharge from the hospital, my wife also won a substantial amount in the lottery. She had come across a newspaper article detailing the young woman's murder, and the numbers printed on the paper led to her win. Despite my pleas, my wife refused to donate the money, sparking arguments between us. To my dismay, my wife began exhibiting strange behavior. She started wearing red t-shirts and black skirts, and her temper grew increasingly volatile. One morning, she expressed feelings of despair, claiming life was meaningless. Fearing for her well-being, I immediately gave up all the money we had won. I took her to a church and sought the help of priests to release the young woman's soul from purgatory. Following this incident, I swore off gambling and distanced myself from any involvement in such activities. Not long after, I made the difficult decision to surrender my taxi license, hoping to leave behind the haunting memories of that fateful night. As an investment banker, I've always been accustomed to the finer things in life. From fancy cars to luxurious apartments, my lifestyle was one of opulence and comfort. However, nothing could have prepared me for the eerie encounter that would shake the very foundation of my rationalist beliefs. It all started during a routine client visit in July 2019. I was tasked with handling a crucial short-term investment for one of our big clients, and the pressure was on to deliver results. Little did I know that this visit would lead me down a path of uncertainty and fear. The client's office was located near a cemetery that had gained notoriety for its alleged paranormal activity. Stories of ghostly apparitions and inexplicable phenomena had been circulating in the media, but I dismissed them as nothing more than sensationalized tales. However, my skepticism was put to the test when one of the employees, Ron, warned me about the gossip surrounding the cemetery. Brushing off his concerns, I assured him that such stories were nothing more than urban legends. As the days passed, I found myself working late into the night at the client's office, often leaving past 9:30 p.m. On one particularly stormy evening, my usual driver was unable to pick me up, leaving me stranded in the pouring rain. Desperate to get back to my hotel, I turned to ride-hailing apps like Uber and Lyft, but their services were severely disrupted due to the weather. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I spotted a taxi available on my Uber app. Despite the exorbitant fare, I booked the cab and eagerly awaited its arrival. However, as soon as I stepped inside, I was greeted by a foul stench that filled the air. Appalled by the uncleanliness of the cab, I confronted the driver, demanding an explanation. To my surprise, the driver remained unfazed by my outburst, offering only a half-hearted apology. As we made our way through the rain-soaked streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Minutes later, the driver pulled up to the gates of the cemetery, informing me that he needed to retrieve his food. Confused and infuriated by his bizarre behavior, I watched in disbelief as he disappeared into the darkness. When he returned with a box of hot food, I was at a loss for words. Unable to comprehend what was happening, I demanded answers from the driver, but his response only deepened the mystery surrounding him. After finally arriving at my hotel, I wasted no time in lodging a complaint with Uber, determined to hold the driver accountable for his unprofessional conduct. However, what I discovered next made my mind go crazy. According to the Uber call center, there was no record of my trip from the previous night, and the driver I had encountered had been involved in a fatal accident 6 months prior. Shocked and bewildered, I was left questioning the reality of my experience. As I stared at my phone, I noticed a notification from the Uber app, a request for a rating from driver DaCosta for our supposed journey together. It was then that I realized the true nature of the encounter, a brush with the unknown that defied all logic and reason. This story is about my friend and her scary taxi ride going home. She had been out late working on a school project, and since she lived in a rural area in Philippines, she figured it would be safe to take a taxi home in the late hours. It was around midnight when she called for the ride, and she couldn't help but notice that the driver kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, then turning to look at her directly. It was odd, to say the least. What made the taxi ride even stranger, besides the odd glances from the driver, was that he kept taking turns on corners he shouldn't have. My friend started to feel afraid, not just because of the driver's odd behavior, but also because it seemed like they were driving into the middle of nowhere. Instead of asking the driver to stop, she decided to stay in her seat and see where they were going. As the ride continued, my friend noticed that they were back on the route they were supposed to be on in the first place. It was a relief, but the tension in the car was still palpable. Before they reached her destination, the driver turned to my friend and apologized if he had scared or startled her. He then asked her to do him a favor and burn all her clothes when she got home. My friend was taken aback by the request and asked the driver why he was acting so strangely. That's when he explained that he had been glancing at her because her head wasn't attached to her body when he looked in the rearview mirror. He had changed the route earlier, hoping to get away from whatever bad energy was present in that area. And he wanted her to burn her clothes because he believed that the bad energy might still be with her. Shaken and terrified, my friend agreed to burn her clothes as soon as she got home. A few days later, she found out on the news that the Uber driver had died a day after their encounter. It turned out that the warning he had given her wasn't for her, but for himself. The incident left my friend feeling unsettled and haunted by the strange encounter. I grumbled as I rubbed my arm nervously, eyeing the land behind me. Trust your car to break down just beside the cemetery. Not in, beside, I retorted, annoyed that Lola had repeated the same sentence for the third time. Whatever, still creepy. Lola spoke softly as she came closer to me. Whose bright idea was it to add another 6 extra games of bowling back at the AMF bowling? Sam complained before nodding her head at the bus stop in front of us. At least we could have hopped onto the last bus or something. Now it's almost 2 in the morning. I dialed the number of another local cab company after unsuccessful attempts from other companies. I tried to book Lyft and Uber, but to my luck, none showed up. No one was willing to pick us up. I didn't blame them. We were standing beside the notorious old cemetery, the largest and most active cemetery to date, housing graves of thousands of people respectively. Some taxi drivers didn't even dare to drop passengers 500 meters from the cemetery in the daytime. To make matters worse, we were stuck here in the wee hours of Friday night, where some cultures believe it's the most unclean night, when these bad souls love to come out and play. I forgot to mention that one of the army bases was just opposite the cemetery, and soon a third of the graves would be exhumed to make way for the army base's expansion plans in the future. 3 taxis had already sped up and whizzed past us when they saw us hailing. I'm tired of standing around. It's been 45 minutes to an hour. I'm going to sit at the bus stop. Sam dragged her feet towards the bus stop. My eyes followed her as Sam plonked her body onto one of the seats and began fiddling with her phone. There's a taxi. Lola tapped my shoulder furiously. I turned my head towards the road, and true enough, there was a taxi waiting about 10 meters away from us. I found it strange that it did not stop directly in front of us. Lola, did you hail it? I asked, suddenly feeling nervous. No, it just stopped, Lola replied, confused. What are you guys waiting for? Get in! Sam shouted from the direction of the bus stop. Turning our heads to face her, I froze. There, sitting on the bus stop shelter, directly above Sam was a figure dressed in blue with hair that stretched out onto the seats of the bus stop below it. Its long hair was flowing like waves. Here's the thing, it was not a windy night. I quickly ran towards Sam, grabbed her hand, turned back, and started running. I screamed at Lola to get into the taxi. From Lola's shocked expression, I knew she had also seen what I saw. Why are your faces so pale? Sam questioned me between ragged breathing. Don't ask many questions, just get in the taxi. Something about the taxi was creepy. It was driving at a very slow pace. I looked at the speedometer, 30 kilometers per hour, but it beats being stuck outside near a cemetery with that figure dressed in blue. I shivered. Lola was literally rocking herself back and forth as she huddled closer to me. It was obvious that she was terrified. Is anyone going to tell me what's going on? Sam, who was sitting at the front passenger seat, stared at the both of us. Lola and I were seated at the back. I saw the thing at the bus stop too. That's why I don't usually drive to the cemetery. I always try to avoid passing by the cemetery at night, the taxi driver suddenly spoke. But I was dropping off this army boy earlier. Poor boy. I look at him so pitiful, waiting by the side of the road, so I gave him a ride. He didn't want to stop in front of the entrance. Said he wanted to walk. Maybe you'd seen him alighting earlier. Lola's face started to pale, and she slowly shook her head at me. I was starting to feel uneasy. I definitely did not see any army personnel walking near the taxi earlier. You ladies are lucky that I was around the corner, he added, his eyes focused on the road in front of him. I was the last to alight among my friends, as we all had different destinations. Just as I paid my fare, the taxi driver turned around and asked, "Where to next?" Who are you talking to?" I stammered, my left hand nervously rattling the door handle on my right while I eyed the empty space on my left. "Miss, please don't joke around. I'm talking to your friend, the one sitting beside you. The four of you took my taxi together." Let me tell you about an odd incident that happened not too long ago. I'm 24 years old and currently a medical student. I've always been skeptical about the paranormal and superstitions, but there's one thing I firmly believe in. Where there's good, there's also evil. The incident occurred when I was back home, awaiting the arrival of my younger sister. My grandparents and I decided to hire an Uber driver who's well known to our family. He's an elderly gentleman, probably in his mid to late 60s, with about 5 years of experience driving for Uber. It was around 2 a.m. when we set out to pick up my sister from the train station. We embarked on our journey from Bangalore to Trichy, which usually involves an overnight train ride, followed by a bus or taxi journey to our hometown. The route passes through a national highway, with a few small villages scattered along the way and vast stretches of barren land covered with bushes and trees. The trip to Trichy was uneventful, and I even managed to doze off for a bit. After picking up my sister, we began our journey back home. My sister and grandparents were fast asleep in the back, leaving me to keep the driver company in the front. The cool night air and some small talk with the driver kept me wide awake. As we traversed the highway, the moonlight and our car's headlights illuminated the road ahead. However, there was a particular stretch of the road that always gave me the chills. The dense foliage of the trees overhead created an almost pitch-black tunnel, making me feel uneasy. Engrossed in conversation with the driver, I didn't notice the road ahead until he gave me a curious look. Following his gaze, I spotted a faint outline of a person standing by the side of the road, about 100 feet away. As we drew closer, I could make out that it was a woman dressed in a white gown, her back turned to us. She seemed to be hitchhiking, with her arm outstretched onto the road. Feeling sorry for her, I suggested to the driver that we offer her a lift. However, he mumbled something about not having enough space in the car and advised against it. As we approached her, she stepped onto the road and stood there, blocking our path with her back still facing us. I panicked, fearing we might hit her at our current speed. I urged the driver to slow down and even tugged at his sleeve in alarm. But instead of slowing down, the driver's face turned pale and he began chanting something while accelerating hard. I was terrified, yelling at him to stop as we hurtled towards the woman. And then, something inexplicable happened. It felt as though we drove right through her without any impact or resistance. I turned to look back through the rear window, expecting to see her behind us. To my astonishment, she was still standing in the middle of the road, her back to us, and her arm outstretched. Confused and shaken, I questioned the driver why he didn't stop and accused him of nearly hitting her. But he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Eventually, we reached a small village where the driver stopped for tea and a smoke. He approached me, putting his arm around my shoulder, and asked me not to tell anyone about what had happened. Intrigued, I pressed him for an explanation. He hesitated, warning me that what he was about to say was disturbing. But I insisted, and he finally relented. He explained that what we saw was no ordinary woman, but an evil entity known as Mohini, or devil. According to him, these entities lure unsuspecting travelers to their deaths, often posing as hitchhikers on deserted highways. He cautioned me never to stop for anyone on the highway, especially during the wee hours of the morning. I nodded silently, realizing the gravity of what I had witnessed. We finished our tea and resumed our journey home. In the years that followed, I learned to heed the warnings of the supernatural and never to underestimate the power of evil lurking in the shadows. In my later years, I learned that the people of my state have a name for the entity I witnessed. They call it Mohini, means devil. These entities are infamous for luring young men to their deaths. I remember this strange incident vividly, which occurred last year when I was working for a large financial technology firm. It was during my evening shift, which stretched from 5:30 p.m. to 3 a.m. As the clock struck 3 a.m., I decided to book an Uber to head back home. As the Uber driver navigated through the streets, passing by a place known as Packer's Den, a sudden sensation of intense warmth and suffocation engulfed all of us in the cab. It was as if the air around us had turned thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. We were gripped by a fear, as if our lives were in peril. Amidst this suffocating atmosphere, a ghostly white figure appeared in our path, causing the car to collide with it. The impact was unsettling. Strangely, within just a minute of passing that place, everything returned to normal. The oppressive heat dissipated, the suffocation lifted, and we could breathe freely once again. We were all shaken by the experience and decided to investigate. We walked about 100 meters from where the incident occurred, hoping to find what we had hit. However, to our bewilderment, there was no trace of anyone or anything. Confused and unnerved, we exchanged uneasy glances, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Turning back towards the car, when we realized that the car itself was missing. Panic set in as we wondered how the car could have vanished into thin air. The next day, fueled by curiosity and a desire for answers, we reached out to some locals in the area. It was then that we learned about a tragic incident that had occurred a couple of years ago. A woman who worked in the same financial tech firm as us was returning home from work when she was fatally struck by a cab near Packer's Den. As we connected the dots between the ghostly encounter we had experienced and the tragic fate of the woman, it seemed that her spirit still present in that area, haunting those who crossed her path. We learned that since that fateful night, numerous strange and horrifying incidents had occurred in the vicinity. It was a sweltering summer night when I picked up a young woman outside the central hospital. As she got into the taxi, her demeanor struck me as peculiar, but I didn't think much of it at first. "Where to?" I asked politely, trying to initiate some conversation. "Yoshida Town," she replied softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. As we drove, I attempted to make small talk, commenting on the oppressive heat of the night. However, she remained silent, her face appearing unnaturally pale in the dim light of the car. Concerned, I asked if she was feeling all right, but she simply replied with a curt yes before falling silent once more. I focused on the road ahead, eager to reach our destination. Finally, we arrived at Yoshida Town, and she instructed me to stop the taxi. However, when it came time to pay the fare, she claimed to have no money and asked me to wait while she went inside a nearby house. Minutes ticked by, but she didn't return. Growing impatient, I decided to investigate and approached the house. As I began to explain the situation to the woman who answered the door, she looked visibly startled. Describing the young woman's appearance, I mentioned her floral dress, only to be met with shock from the woman. Invited inside, I was led to a room where I saw a framed photo of the same young woman I had picked up from the hospital. Stunned, I realized the truth. The woman I had given a ride to was not among the living. She had passed away earlier that day, and her spirit had sought one last journey home. Tears streaming down her face, the woman explained that the young woman in the photo was her daughter, and they were holding her wake that very night.